Hello, I'm Peter. I was always resigned to the fact that this is what I was going to do with my life. See, I was a fisherman. My father was a fisherman. My grandfather was a fisherman. Probably my kids are going to do the same thing. It's not that I hated the job or I didn't like it. I mean, nothing wrong with hard work for fair wages. Especially when I had a family to support. I just always felt that there was something greater for my life in the future, though. That's when it happened. I'll never forget the day I met him. We were cleaning our nets from fishing the night before, and we'd had no luck at all. And up walks this guy from Nazarene, a man named Jesus. And he says, "Why don't you try fishing in the deeper waters?" Clearly, this guy was no fisherman. Or so we thought. To this day, I still don't know why I did what he asked of me. There was just something about him that made me want to trust him. So we gathered up our nets and we headed out to these deeper waters. I go to throw my nets over the side of the boat like I had done so many times before, and Jesus says, "Why don't you try throwing your nets on the other side of the boat?" This'll never work, I thought to myself. But I did. And when you know it, fish started coming in by the bucketful. More than my little boat could handle, more than the nets could hold. And that's when I knew this was a holy man. And all of a sudden, standing in his presence, I saw my own glaring, sinful life. He seemed to sense what I was feeling. And he came over and he said these words I'll never forget. He said, "Don't be afraid, for soon you will catch men."
My name is Judas. I've always loved things. Possessions. Money. Oh, I've had lots of jobs, but I can't always say that I earned money at those jobs like I should have. I mean, I cut corners and I skimmed off the top and finagled what I could to get as much money as I could into my pocket. But at the end of the day, it was never enough. You know, there reached a point where greed had such a hold of my heart that I would steal from my friends, from my family. I didn't care who I stole from, just as long as I got what I wanted. I never got caught either. Well, I mean, most of the time I didn't get caught. I was so tricky, I knew how to cover my tracks. But on a very, very rare occasion, I would get caught, and I'd always do the same thing. Run. Run from my past. Run from the people I stole from. Do you know what the problem with running is you can only run for so long until eventually you just get tired. That's the place in life I was at when I met Jesus. I'll never forget that first time I met him. Because when I met him, it's like my whole life was just laid bare before him. And yet he loved me. He called me to follow him. And I was ready to turn over a new leaf. To start over. And so I followed him. It didn't take long until people started financially supporting him. His ministry began to grow, and they were looking for a volunteer to oversee the finances. I knew it was a bad idea. I knew that I should just avoid it. But nobody else was stepping up. And so I found myself taking care of the financial aspect of Jesus' ministry. And I also found myself stealing again.
Growing up, life was tough. Between being part of a big family with lots of brothers and sisters and parents that constantly fought, I guess I always kind of felt forgotten about. I always felt like a burden. And as a young girl, my plans were to fit in, to find the normal, to make friends. That's when I fell into the wrong crowd. I started hanging out with people who were not always the best influence on me, to say the least. We did all sorts of things that I knew weren't right, but I wanted so desperately to fit in that I went along with it. The more I hung around these people, the more I realized I was lying more and stealing from people I didn't even know. I wouldn't say that I grew up a perfect person, but I was a pretty good person who did the right thing most of the time. But the more I hung around these people, the more I found myself being filled with this anger towards everyone around me. That's when my so-called friends introduced me to this evil presence. This presence promised me power and the ability to do supernatural things. I knew at first it was wrong. I knew at first this presence made me do things that made me feel awful inside. But I just embraced what they were doing. It's hard to explain, really, but it's like the spirit that had entered inside of me was changing who I was. I found myself depressed and moody and irritable all the time. But this presence promised me that he would care for me. He promised me that he would help me, which was exactly what I wanted in life. Next thing I knew, I had 7 demonic spirits inside of me. They were running my life. I couldn't control my actions. I couldn't control my thoughts. I couldn't control the words that were coming out of my own mouth. I was plagued in darkness. I just wanted them to leave me alone. They wouldn't.
We met a lot of people on our journey with Jesus. Some of some amazing people. And then we met a lot of hurting people. People that were plagued with these awful diseases, and yet Jesus healed them all. And then there were some people that we met that were possessed with this evil spirit. I remember this one woman, she came and she had such venom, such anger inside of her. I don't know how else to explain it, but Jesus changed her. She was different. One time, all of us disciples, we were together in this man's house, and this woman that had been set free of this demonic oppression came right in, and she went right to the feet of Jesus. She started anointing his feet with this expensive perfume. I mean, this wasn't cheap stuff. This had to cost over a year's worth of wages. And here she was just lavishly pouring it on Jesus' feet. And nobody said anything. I couldn't believe it. I sat and I watched as the bottle nearly dropped out and the house began to fill with the fragrant smell. I finally had enough. I jumped to my feet. I said, "How could you be so irresponsible? What a waste of money!" I looked around, and everyone was so tense. Do you know what the strange thing was? The woman never once stopped anointing Jesus' feet, even as I'm yelling at her. And then of all things, Jesus stands up and he rebukes me for what I said. I tried to explain to him. I said, we could have taken that perfume and we could have sold it. We could have gone down to a local market vendor, and I could think of 2 or 3 vendors off the top of my head that would have paid a premium price for that perfume. And then I tried to tell them we could have taken that money and given it to the poor. Well, I mean, I think we could have given some of it to the poor. No, I just wanted the money for myself.
My relationship with Jesus was special. I'm sure everybody thought that, but I honestly feel like we shared this special connection. I remember this time that there was this really sick girl. And her dad, this synagogue ruler, he'd come running up to Jesus, begging him to help his little girl. The crowds were huge that day. It was becoming typical because everyone either wanted to be healed by Jesus, to hear him teach, or just see who he was. The dad seemed so desperate. And Jesus, he looked at him with those eyes, those compassionate eyes. And we agreed to go. But on our way to the house, news had reached the father that this little girl had died. And that didn't stop Jesus. He seemed to know something the rest of us didn't. So we went anyway. And when we got there, oh, it was so sad. Everybody was crying and sobbing. And Jesus, he gets up in front of him. And he says, "Don't worry. She's only sleeping." Right then, the mood in the whole place changed. No more sorrow or despair, but cynicism. And they stood there and they laughed at him. But Jesus, he took John, James, and myself into the room with the little girl. It was such an awful sight. She looked like a corpse. Somebody who should have been running around with so much life in her was lying there, dead. And then Jesus, he grabbed her by the hand. And instantly, the color started coming back into her. She started breathing again. And she sat up, alive. There was just something about his touch. And only the three of us got to see it.
My family didn't like the new me. They disowned me because they thought I was spinning out of control. My supposed friends, they thought I'd become too much, completely abandoned me. Everyone abandoned me. Nobody wanted anything to do with me. All I had left were my 7 new friends. I was so alone, so broken. Everywhere I went, I saw those looks of judgment from others. Those rumors and stories, I heard them. I'd reached a point where I felt like no one cared about me. I tried to get help. I tried to see those religious people, but they just condemned me all the more, telling me it was because of my sin that I was the way I was. And then I saw some good people. They tried to help me. They tried praying with me and talking with me, but every time those spirits would come back, and I'd lose who I was again. And over again, I was plagued with the thoughts of ending my life. I was out of control. I fixated on the different ways I'd do it. I had the perfect plan. But then I met him. There was a lot of people that day. And I learned to isolate myself and usually hated even the thought of being around people like that. But I guess it was curiosity. Curiosity of who this man Jesus was, that I went to him. And as I got closer, the spirits told me to turn and run. They almost convinced me to. But I couldn't do it. I had to see this man Jesus. I had to meet him. But as I got so close, I could see him. The spirit started shaking me. I started screaming and getting violent. I must have scared a lot of people, because they were running in all different directions away from me. But Jesus didn't. He didn't seem afraid at all. He beckoned me closer and put his hands on me. He rebuked the spirits, and immediately they left. And for the first time, I felt free. I felt normal. Then Jesus took me in his arms, something no one had ever done for me before. And I felt loved. And I felt safe. It was in that moment that I knew I would give my life to him.
As the years went by, Jesus grew more and more popular. But why wouldn't he? Here was a man that healed so many people. That he made the cripple run again. He opened the eyes of men that were blind. He even called the dead back to life. The public loved Jesus. Huge crowds would gather just to hear him teach. And as he grew more and more popular, the religious leaders, I guess they got jealous. They didn't like this new teaching that he had about God. And there was a rumor going around that they would offer 30 pieces of silver to anyone that knew his schedule, that was intimately aware of his routine, and that could hand Jesus over to them. At first, I dismissed the thought altogether. Jesus was my friend. I loved him. I could never betray him. I kept thinking about how much money that was. And how Jesus, he could take care of himself, and the public, they'd never let anything bad happen to him. What's the worst that could happen? There were a lot of days I started making my way down that road to go see those chief priests. But every time I stopped in my tracks, I couldn't do it. But then at night, I would lay there, all hours of the night, thinking about how easy life would be with that money. I don't know why. I don't know what finally broke it in me, but I went to them. As I walked into that room where the chief priests were, it was the strangest thing. It was like they were expecting me to walk in, as if they knew I'd be the one to betray him. We started talking about what kind of arrangements we need to make, about Jesus' schedule, about what they would do, about what I would do, and before I knew it, we were done. I left that meeting sick to my stomach, knowing in my heart I had done the wrong thing. But it was too late. The plan was already set in motion.
So many stories. I can tell you about the time that Jesus came walking to us on the water. It was the middle of the night, and we're in this crazy storm at sea. And we hear this voice call out, "Don't be afraid." Nobody in the boat moved. And then Jesus called out, "Come." I knew in that moment I wanted nothing more in life than to be with him. So I got out of the boat. And for a few glorious moments, I was walking on the water. And then I took my eyes off Jesus. And I began to look at the storm around me. I started to sink. I'd lost my faith. Or I could tell you about this time that we were all sitting around and Jesus asked us who others thought he was. And we stopped and we talked about the different theories that people had. And then he asked the disciples who we thought he was. Everybody went silent. They all looked down, afraid they were going to say the wrong thing. But I was going to say something. I knew who he was. You're the Christ, the Messiah. Because that's who I honestly believed him to be. came across his face, and he seemed pleased. And then he said, "You will no longer be called Simon, but Peter. And on you, the rock, I will build my church." And of everybody he could have said this to, he said, I was the one to help him build his church. I didn't doubt him for a second. Because if Jesus believed in me, then I knew I could do it.
I loved Jesus. All I ever wanted to do was be with him. There was a band of women just like me who Jesus had changed, and we had committed ourselves to doing whatever spare jobs we could because we wanted to help him financially, because we believed in his ministry. And then I went around telling anyone I could about who I used to be and how Jesus had changed me, and I encouraged each and every one of them to follow him. And then I watched as Jesus over and over again touched and healed people just like me. There were some people who thought that us women were just weak-minded and that Jesus was just taking advantage of us. But it simply wasn't true. Jesus loved us. He loved us like no one ever had. And all we ever wanted to do was love him back. I know not everyone loved Jesus like we did. I know that there were some people who were uncomfortable with what Jesus stood for, or were jealous of his ministry. I also know that there were some people who were plotting to harm Jesus. But I couldn't listen to it. No way that would happen to Jesus. But as the crowds began to turn, and people continued to plot against him, there was one thing I had determined. And it was that no matter what happened, I would never leave Jesus' side. No matter what.
I was hours away from receiving my reward money. It was the Passover. Jesus was calling us all together to commemorate a meal that our ancestors always celebrated, our deliverance from Egypt and slavery into freedom. Before I walked into that room, I just felt this darkness come over me. As I went in, I saw Jesus on the other side of the room. And he was off. Something was bothering him that night. I couldn't put my finger on it. We all sat down for the meal. And then Jesus did the most peculiar thing. He pulled out a bowl. He took out his outer coat. He began to wash our feet. It was so humiliating. It was so embarrassing. He was our master. He was our teacher. We were his disciples, and our feet were so filthy with the dirt. And here he was washing our feet. He was going to wash my feet. And I was just about to betray him. I couldn't even stand to watch him do it. I just turned away. One by one, he made his way around the circle, and then he eventually got to me. Everything within me just wanted to run away in that moment. But I tried to maintain my composure. I thought that'd be the most difficult part of the night, but it wasn't. He got up after washing our feet, and he began to talk in graphic detail about how he would be arrested, about how he'd be put on trial and how he would suffer and die. I'd heard him talk like this before, but we always just figured he was kind of paranoid. But this night, as he talked, it's as if he'd already been there, as if he knew what was going to happen. And then he said, it's one of us that would betray him. I knew that he was talking about me. I don't know what happened after that. The rest of the disciples, they got up, they started arguing among themselves and started pointing fingers. And for the first time I looked into his eyes. I said, surely not I, Rabbi. And with those eyes of love, he looked back at me and he said, yes, it's you. He calmed the rest of the disciples down, and then he said, the one who dips the bread into the bowl with me, that's the one. And he handed me the bread. You know, every muscle within me tried not to dip it into that bowl with him, but I just couldn't help myself. And after I dipped it in the bowl with him, he said, go, do quickly what you have to do. And I ran. Because I was afraid the other disciples will have heard, that they would have figured out what was going on. And so I went to the chief priests.
It was the strangest of nights. We're celebrating the Passover meal like we had done so many times before. And Jesus starts talking about how one of us is going to betray him. And that he's going to be put to death. I'd heard Jesus talk about this before, and every time it bothered me. But this time, it seemed different. Like it was going to happen right away. So I started to look around the circle, try to figure out who it could be. And then I realized Jesus really needed was a friend. Somebody he could depend on. So I jumped up. With everybody looking at me, I looked Jesus right in the eye and I said, Lord, I will never betray you. I will be with you to the very end. If that means going to prison or even put to death with you, I will do it. And then he looked at me with such pain and sorrow. And he said, Peter, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. His words, they cut right through me. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to act. After that, everything happened so fast. One moment we're in this upper room eating dinner, the next we're in this garden. I tried so hard to stay awake, to pray, to stay focused. But my eyes, they were just so heavy. And Jesus, he kept coming and waking us up, begging for us to stay awake. And then suddenly these torches appeared out of nowhere. And this group of soldiers, they were angry with swords. They were upon us. I jumped up. Now was my time to make good on my promise, to defend Jesus. And I drew my sword and I grazed one of the ears of the soldiers. Jesus said, no, stop. Put down your sword. And then he reached up and he healed the soldier's ear. And then he gave himself up peacefully. And in a moment, he was the prisoner. Instantly, my heart changed. I was no longer brave, but filled with this great fear. If they could get to Jesus, surely they could get to us too. So I ran. And I led Jesus away. I tried to follow at a distance to see what was going to happen, what they were going to do to him. I was so tired, I was so cold. I found this nearby fire and I tried to warm myself up. But the crowd around me, they began to recognize me. They pointed at me and said I was one of his followers. I knew I should have stuck up for him. I knew I should have claimed my friendship for him. But I was so afraid. Afraid that they would have the soldiers come get me too. I denied him. 3 times I denied him. I was so confused. I was so afraid. I was so angry. And then I heard the rooster crow. And from a distance, I saw Jesus look right at me. It was the worst feeling in the world. And I began to sob uncontrollably.
I can remember when I got the news that they had taken Jesus and that they were going to crucify him. I ran as fast as I could. And when I got there, he barely looked recognizable. They had beaten him so badly. I don't know where most of the other disciples were, but the crowds were so hostile. They all just kept shouting and making fun of him. I prayed that it would all come to an end. I prayed that the guards would see that he was innocent and that they would have mercy on him and realize that he had had enough. But they never did. And I watched as he struggled for hours on that cruel tree, gasping for air and slowly fading. I will never forget what he said to his enemies in that moment. Forgive them. Even in his last breath, that's what he chose to say. Forgive them? The earth trembled, and darkness covered the sky, and in a moment, he was gone. I waited as they took him down from that tree to see where they were going to lay his body. I was there with Joseph and Nicodemus to anoint and care for his body. Then they laid him in that cold, empty tomb, sealing him in. I couldn't believe what I was watching. He was gone.
He was in the garden. I knew he'd be in the garden. He was always in the garden. Late at night, early in the morning, always praying. I had no idea how many soldiers they'd send with me. They were ready for a fight. They had swords and clubs and torches. I tried to tell them it was unnecessary. That Jesus wasn't a violent man. But they wouldn't listen. It was so dark. It was so late. And it was the longest journey of my life, leading these madmen into the peaceful garden. We came to where the disciples were my friends, and they were asleep. I had arranged a signal with the soldiers. I said, the one I kissed, that's the one. Arrest him. We finally came upon Jesus. I went to him and I kissed him. The soldiers, they took over immediately. They arrested him, they threw me the money, and the job was done. I couldn't stay. I didn't know what to do. I went back to the chief priest. I said, I changed my mind. I don't want to do this after all. I even tried to give them the money back, but they wouldn't take it. The disciples, they turn on me when they figured it all out. The chief priests weren't my friends anymore, and in that moment I was so alone, so broken. I heard these voices, they're like shouting to me, I'd gone too far. I could never be forgiven for what I'd done. The pain was so great, I couldn't stand it anymore. So I took the way out that I thought would be best.
It really happened. He died. He suffered on that cruel cross just like he said he was going to. When I saw him bury him in that tomb, I felt like I had died too. With Jesus gone, what was the point of anything anymore? I guess I'd go back to what I'd always known, back to fishing. I was so lost. My life without purpose. Sometime later, several of us found ourselves out at sea fishing again. And from the shore, we saw this familiar figure. And he calls out asking if we've caught anything. And from the sands, he says, why don't you try throwing your nets over the other side? It was John who first said, it's the Lord. I recognized that voice. I got out of the boat because rowing would have taken too long, and I swam to the shore as fast as I could. And when I got there was Jesus. And he was cooking us breakfast. We all sat and we ate with him. It felt so good to have him back. To know that Jesus was alive. But in all the excitement, I began to remember what I had done. I denied him just like he said I was going to. I'm so embarrassed. I'm so ashamed. And Jesus, he pulls me from the group and has to speak with me. And as we're walking, he stops. And he asks, do you love me? Was this a trick question? Surely he knew that I loved him. I replied right away, yes, Lord, I love you. And feed my lambs. Walk a little further, this time not saying much. And again we stopped. And he asked, do you love me? Why would he ask me again? What was he trying to prove? I thought a little bit longer, and again he said, yes, Lord, I love you. And tend my sheep. Started walking again, and this time neither of us said anything. After a long while, we stopped. One last time, he asked, do you love me? His question was so hard to hear. What could I do to prove it to him? I looked him right in the eye, and I said, I love you. And I meant every word of it. And then he looked at me, not with judgment doubt, filled with love for me. He said, feed my sheep. It was then that I realized that he wasn't questioning my love for him. He was forgiving me for every time that I had denied him. And he was restoring me so I could serve him again.
On so many occasions, Jesus talked about his death. And every time he did, he talked about how he would rise again in 3 days. I don't think we ever quite understood what he was talking about when he said that, no matter how many times he explained it to us. It was early that Sunday morning that I went to the tomb. Something inside me just told me I had to go. I had to be near him. And when I got there, to my horror, someone had rolled away the stone. And I immediately thought they must have taken his body. It wasn't enough that they had tortured and killed him, but now they couldn't even leave his body alone? There was a man in the distance. I thought he must be the gardener, for the sun wasn't fully up yet. And I couldn't see clearly. I ran to him. I begged him if he knew where my Lord was to tell me so I could see to him. Then he turned to me and he said my name, Mary. And in an instant I knew it was him. I ran to him. I couldn't believe it. Jesus was alive. And out of all the people he could have showed himself to first, he showed himself to me. Death had been defeated. The grave had lost. And Jesus is alive.